My name is Joe Kim, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to welcome you to the Education and Cognition public lecture, which closes out a busy first day at the 12th annual McMaster Conference on Education and Cognition. I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The territory was the subject of the Dish Was One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. I'd also like to take a moment to thank all of our campus partners, including the McCall-McBain Postdoctoral Fellows Teaching and Leadership Program, the McPherson Institute for Innovation and Excellence in Teaching and Learning, the Faculty of Science, Department of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Behavior, the Alumni Association, and the Office of the President for their ongoing support for making all of these events possible over the last 12 years. So we have people participating in tonight's public lecture, both virtually as well as in person here at McMaster University. And for those of you who are joining us online, please post your questions on the chat, and Katie will be monitoring, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible, and Katie will just read out the questions on your behalf. So it's really my pleasure to set the stage for tonight's public lecture. Joining me tonight are two colleagues that I've called upon to help us make sense of the mechanisms which may contribute to the motivation side of this question I posed here. And I think in the coming years, research on understanding the connections between a healthy body and mind will be important for us to understand the circumstances that can motivate, ideally, a society of lifelong learners. So I just want to introduce the two speakers that will follow in the next section. They are Dr. Marty Gibala and Katie McClelland. Dr. Marty Gibala is a professor of kinesiology at McMaster University, and he examines the effects of exercise at the molecular to whole body level in both healthy individuals and people with chronic diseases. And in addition to basic mechanistic studies on the regulation of skeletal muscle energy metabolism, his labs conducts applied research that examines the impact of physical training and nutrition on human health and performance. And what I really love about Marty's research is at the end of the day, he's very interested in practical applications. What can normal people actually do to increase their overall exercise participation? Katie's been teaching yoga full-time since 1997, and she's actually one of my favorite yoga instructors. She likes to joke that she was born certified to teach as her mother went through yoga teacher training when she was pregnant. In 2006, she founded Della Soul Yoga Studios, and she has trained over 500 yoga teachers and teaches workshops and hosts retreats abroad. And she co-facilitates an online personal development course, Exalted Life. And she's also the host of Yoga with Katie, a 30-minute instructional yoga show, which airs 6 days a week. And she actually filmed an entire season over the last 2 days, including today. And she still made it here in time for tonight's public lecture. So thank you so much, Katie. So this is the question that I would like to ambitiously try to answer tonight. How do we harness the science of learning to motivate a society of lifelong learners? So I'm a cognitive psychologist. I study things like attention and memory, and I'm trying to understand how human beings learn. And I do this through my lab called the Education and Cognition Lab. I'm also a teacher. I teach our gigantic introductory psychology course here at McMaster University. We have over 3,000 students per semester. And a common link between these two roles that I have is that I'm interested in understanding the conditions that lead to durable learning. So that's kind of the background of what we're trying to do in this conference. And if I kind of look ahead into the future, I feel pretty confident that we're going to figure this all out. What I mean by that is that our research eventually should lead to a point where if you need to be able to perform at a certain level Understanding this base of information under these contexts at this later point in the future, well, here's exactly what you should do. But of course, the challenge is, how do you get people to do what they should do? So, in some workshops I give to instructors, I ask them, what does it take to be a healthy person? And people say, well, I think you're supposed to sleep, like maybe 8 hours a day. I think you should exercise, maybe get in some cardio and like some resistance training, and you should eat healthy. And then, my next question would be like, well, do you want me to show you some data to back up these assertions that you have? I'm like, no, 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 I believe it. And then the next question obviously is, well, are you doing it? And well, sort of, I'm trying to work that in. And so it's the same thing with educational practices. Even if we figure everything out, the much more difficult part is the motivation aspect. So let me just give you an example of how we figure things out. So here is an example of an application of what we might call spaced retrieval practice that's interleaved. So a lot of fancy terms here, but very simple. In a tutorial this week in a class that I'm teaching, I might ask a review question like this. How does tonotopic organization of sound, something that we discussed last week, differ from topographic organization of vision, which we're discussing this week? So this accomplishes a couple of things. It tells the student, you can't just forget what you learned last week. It's connected directly to what we've learned this week. And tonotopic and topographic are things that you might get confused. There's interesting overlap, but there's also important differences. So this is an example of a pedagogical intervention that I'm purposely building in to the design of the course. Now, of course, the challenge for students, especially as they go from high school into university, is that they're expected to consume volumes of information, a lot of information, more than they might be used to. And then we also expect them to retain that knowledge and then ideally demonstrate mastery by being able to apply that information, knowledge into a novel scenario, something that they couldn't just memorize or couldn't just look up on Google. Now, a student in this situation, sometimes a coping strategy would be to go to the last thing that worked. And maybe in high school, they had a really good memory. They had a really good working memory capacity, and they could memorize everything. And the test questions maybe even rewarded their high working memory capacity. But when you have this huge volume of information, it becomes difficult to make such a strategy successful. So one of the things I try to tell my students is, I want you to think back to a time when you didn't even care about grades. You didn't want to just memorize stuff. You kind of just wanted to understand how the world worked. So this is my daughter, Monica. And here she's just testing out the hypothesis of, can I catch snowflakes on my eyelashes? Why? Why not? I just want to see if I can. When she was 4, she asked me the classic little kid question, does the light in the fridge go out when you close the door? And rather than just kind of reflexively give her an answer, I said, I don't know. What do you think? And her immediate response was, I don't know either, but we're going to find out, right? And so we went through a bunch of different possibilities, and then eventually she came up with this idea of like, let's make a movie, right? So I'm going to get your phone and we're going to make a movie. And
this is experiment for what?
For a scene if the fridge turns off.
The light turns off when we close the fridge?
Yeah.
Here we go.
And it does. So children, I think, are naturally motivated to learn. And somewhere along the line, they might lose that motivation. And so that's one of the things that I personally would like to figure out. How do we motivate learners and apply the principles of the science of learning so that students in higher education scenarios are also continuing to feel motivated to learn and not just study for the grade or memorize something? So one of the interventions I've really become very interested in is interactions between physical activity and cognitive function. And so one of the first studies that really brought my attention to this area was a study by Mark Berman. And what he demonstrated was that when a person is trying to learn a lot of information and they're even feeling overwhelmed, one of the best things that you could do is go for a walk through nature. And so specifically, he demonstrated a 30-minute walk through nature is actually even better than a 30-minute walk, equivalent walk through city blocks. And he's got some really interesting ideas of why that might be the case. The walk through nature might be restorative in nature. And what he's demonstrated is that it seems to improve memory function. So we have some evidence that there's this connection between physical activity and cognitive function. We happen to have one of the world's experts on physical activity and what it does and how it improves overall health function. And as I alluded to earlier, everyone knows that exercise is good for you, but the real challenge is how do you get people to do that? And so one way that Marty has really tried to make this more digestible to people is to even characterize them as exercise snacks. So even if you build things into your daily lifestyle, like taking the stairs instead of taking the elevator, even taking the stairs a few times a day can have a significant impact in your overall health and physical functioning. So we know that when it comes to academics, if you're physically fit, if you participate in physical activity, it's good. It enhances cognitive function, and it correlates with overall improved academic success. So people that move around a lot across different grades, they do better in school. But the question is, why? What is going on here? And so there's a huge hole here that we're trying to figure out. Studies have demonstrated, there's benefits from people who engage in exercise from broad to specific, but lots of outstanding questions. Things like dosing, intensity and frequency, like how often do you have to do it? How intense does this exercise have to be done to translate into improved academic success? What we know so far is any exercise is better than none. It works across all age groups that are studied in these educational studies. But exactly what is going on, there's a lot of room here for people to try to understand. I mean, increasing blood flow to the brain, does that have a function? Lots of cardiovascular benefits, but what else is going on? So from a cognitive perspective, one of the mechanisms that we're thinking about is that exercise, maybe it has some sort of role in impacting reducing inattention and hyperactivity. So this is an active area that people are looking at. So I said that people who exercise a lot and just make it a regular part of their lifestyle, they tend to do better in school. So I guess the model I always think of is like varsity athletes. Any varsity athlete that I've met from a Canadian university, they're really good students. They're absolutely amazing students. They have really busy schedules, obviously getting a lot of physical activity, and they seem to also excel at academics. But a lot of studies have also demonstrated that even a single bout of exercise at moderate to high intensity improves cognition. So all of these things that as a cognitive psychologist, I'm interested in, like attention, concentration, working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, verbal fluency, planning and problem solving. A single bout of aerobic exercise, moderate to high intensity, seems to improve these important cognitive processes that we know are involved in learning and encoding long-term memories. So it's not that you should exercise while you're studying necessarily. So we know that there should be some sort of delay. So you exercise and have at least a 5-minute recovery. That seems to be the minimum level of recovery. And when you do that, it seems to increase performance on these different cognitive functions. Maybe the more exercise you do, the longer lasting that impact can be. And even from a single bout of exercise, some studies have demonstrated a prolonged effect 30 minutes to 2 hours of continued improvement in learning. Um, when we look at school studies, we find that compared to a sedentary class, a control class where they're not involved in exercise, students who participate in early morning exercise have improved positive effects on concentration and social behavior. And so these are things that we think will also translate into overall improved academic performance. And finally, I want to highlight a study that I was involved with here at McMaster University as well. One of the cognitive principles I'm interested in studying is called mind wandering, and so that's how I really got interested in yoga and wellness. And I know many of you attended our wellness event yesterday afternoon. Sometimes you're trying to focus and concentrate on a topic, maybe even what I'm saying right now. And you might be thinking, well, what am I going to be eating for dinner? Your mind might start drifting. Um, that happens. And we know that as you try to focus on a cognitively demanding task, the longer that you do that, the more your mind is going to wander. And so at some point, there's going to be a precipitous drop in your overall attention, motivation, and energy levels. That might be a time for a strategic break. So my lab has actually been studying when should you take breaks and what should you do during those breaks. And so the things that we're interested in are yoga, mindfulness training, listening to a meditation track, exercise, having a healthy snack. And so the idea here is that when you take a break here, it's not going to make you brand new, but maybe it'll stop that pattern of that reduction in overall attention memory. And then you can continue studying and then come back and do that again. So that was the basis of this study. So we were looking specifically at exercise breaks, and inspired by Marty's research, we looked at something called high intensity interval training exercises. This is high intensity exercise like jumping jacks, burpees. Why were we interested in that? Well, past research has shown that moderate to high intensity exercise seems to have this really interesting impact on cognitive function. Our thinking was that, well, it increases arousal, and that can increase focused attention. And when you're paying attention, you can encode memories. So here are the three conditions we looked at. We had one group that was the control no breaks condition. This was sort of like our hero condition. We had students studying 1 week's worth of complex introductory psychology material. It was on the neuroscience of form perception, something that they typically do very poorly on. They all say, this stuff is really hard. They had no breaks. We had no mercy. They had to just keep studying. Another group, we gave them periodic strategic 5-minute breaks where they got to do something fun that they liked. They played a computer game for 5 minutes, and they said that they found it rewarding. Another group, we matched them for their breaks, but instead of playing this fun computer game, we made them do high-intensity interval training exercise. And for these sedentary students, it was quite a shock. And we measured two things. First, how does this impact their attention? And then secondly, how does it impact their memory function? So here's the pattern that we saw from the first immediate to the delayed measures of how much time they spend on their tasks. So a measure of attention. And the first interesting observation is that the no breaks and the non-exercise breaks, the ones that got to play the computer games, they showed the same characteristic pattern of a decline in paying attention. The longer you have to study, the more complex the material, you see this decline. That makes sense. But the really exciting thing that we observed was that the exercise breaks groups, they maintained their focused attention from the first half to the second half of study. So we were pretty excited. So our next question was, well, how does this impact actual performance on the material that they're supposed to learn? So we did a test immediately, and then we brought them back 2 days later for another control test to see how they did. And we found that the exercise breaks groups outperformed the non-exercise and no breaks groups. So that's a little bit of a background. an introduction to connecting motivation to the science of learning. And in our next section, I'm going to ask Marty Gibala to come up and talk a bit more about the role of exercise in creating this healthy body, which we also think is connected to cognitive function and academic success. Marty?
To speak a little bit about the science of physical activity for health benefits, building on some of the introductory comments that he made. So over the next 20 minutes, I'd really like to make 3 key points. And so the first is that I think we have this notion that fitness is important, but I'll try and convince you why it's so important. And so cardiorespiratory fitness, this idea of cardiovascular health, it's a really important health marker to the point that we perhaps should consider it a clinical vital sign, like we consider things like blood pressure, body temperature, things like that. Second, the health benefits of regular physical activity are linked in part to improved or maintained cardiorespiratory fitness. So the health benefits of physical activity are myriad. None of the things I'm talking about today, I directly say, this is why you're a better learner. I'm mainly talking about the physical benefits, but I would suggest that a lot of these benefits are linked to cardiorespiratory fitness and things like enhanced blood flow, including possibly to the brain, as Joe mentioned. And the last point, and this is really where the focus of my lab's research has been, is basically brief practical exercise strategies and demonstrating that if they're sufficiently vigorous, they can be used to meaningfully improve cardiorespiratory fitness and probably some other health benefits as well. But my focus is really going to be on cardiorespiratory fitness. So what is it, right? This is a recent statement from the American Heart Association, massively respected organization, making this point. And so I think we have the sense that fitness is important, but what this is showing is the relationship between your risk of dying and your cardiorespiratory fitness. So whether you identify as a man or a woman, men are in dark bars there, women in open bars, and it's just showing the relationship on the bottom. Starting on the far left is people having a low fitness level, moderate, and high fitness level. And the key point here is just having a moderate versus low fitness level cuts your risk of dying from all causes in half. And to put this in perspective a little bit more, people who have about a 10% higher fitness level. We can measure fitness many different ways, but a simple way is something known as METs. No, that's not a common term you might know, but just think it's having a 10% higher fitness is markedly associated with an improvement. And it's similar to these other things that we might measure in a physician's office. So your reduced risk of dying and developing things like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, being a little bit more fit, it's the same as losing 2 inches off your waist, having a 5-point drop in your systolic blood pressure, or having about a 1 millimolar drop in your blood sugar level. And what it would take pharmacologically or through drug intervention to achieve these changes is a lot. And we can do the same thing with 6, 8, 10 weeks of brief, vigorous exercise. The other point, that's epidemiological evidence, which just says when we look at a lot of people, but it doesn't necessarily say, well, how does a change in fitness affect your risk of dying? And so these are some data from over 90,000 individuals across a broad age range who had 2 measured fitness tests in a laboratory at least 1 year apart. And the pattern for all of these is the same, but basically they divided people into the least fit to the most fit. And so what this is showing is on the far left, people who didn't change at all, their risk is anchored at 1. If you boosted your fitness level, again, by about that 1 MET, you saw a risk reduction, a lower risk of dying from all causes. It was even greater if you saw a greater improvement in your fitness and you got worse. If your fitness got worse, your risk of dying went up. This is the people in the next fit group. You can see exactly the same pattern. Group that we called moderately fit, exact same pattern. And these were the most fit individuals. So what you can see is no matter what your starting fitness level, if you're very unfit or a highly trained athlete, further improvements in your cardiorespiratory fitness are still important. And so the big takeaway from this work, which was just published, and the unique aspect of this is that it quantified the amount of change in your fitness that you need to alter your risk of dying from all causes. And the suggestion here was that encouraging the public to improve their fitness by at least this 1 MET. So keep this 1 MET idea in mind. can have really considerable public health significance. Now, you might say, okay, I'm convinced fitness is important. How do I know what my fitness is? Well, the gold standard, one of the ways would be to come in our laboratory and we do basically an exercise stress test on you. And what we're measuring there, you always see these pictures with people attached to mouthpieces and a hose connected to some machine there. We're measuring their oxygen uptake. And so athletes, you might hear the term VO2 max. Athletes worry about their VO2 max. VO2 max, or your highest rate of oxygen uptake, that's just the clinical marker of cardiorespiratory fitness. And so we measured in our laboratory, but of course this is cumbersome, it's not for everyone. But as Joe alluded to, it reflects a lot of important underlying mechanisms. So the highest rate of oxygen uptake by your body when you're stressed, it's basically related to how well does your heart deliver blood and oxygen, and how well does your body use the oxygen that gets delivered. And there's a lot of complicated underlying physiology there. But why cardiorespiratory fitness is probably such a good metric is it's determined by all of these markers that you see. How well does your heart pump blood? How elastic are your blood vessels? How much mitochondria are in your muscles? All of those physiological things work together to determine your oxygen uptake. And it's probably why fitness is such a good proxy measure of the functioning of the body. But another way, and if you only take one thing away from my talk today, Google World Fitness Level. This is a validated online non-exercise calculator that will allow you to evaluate your fitness without going into a laboratory, without going through a VO2 max test. So Google World Fitness Level, and it'll ask you some simple questions like this. Some fundamental questions about your age, your height, your sex, your maximum heart rate, typically just subjectively, how much physical activity you do, and maybe things like your resting pulse. And it will give you a number. It's not to say that it's a perfectly accurate number, but it's a validated number on very large groups of people. And what it will allow you to do then is to say, how is my number changing over time? Am I getting better? Am I at least maintaining my fitness through whatever my exercise or physical activity routine might be? And just know that this very simple non-exercise algorithm or model of predicting fitness, it also predicts long-term mortality. And the takeaway here was, again, it's a very simple way for people to measure their fitness that's practically useful, and it might identify individuals who are at higher risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. So again, that's just at World Fitness Level, and you can get a number and see how you might stack up relative to the rest of the population. Joe mentioned this, right? So Canada actually doesn't have exercise guidelines. We now have 24-hour movement guidelines, which basically says these are the strategies that we should engage in. These are the behaviors that we should undertake in order to promote health benefits. And it can be quite daunting. There's a physical activity piece that involves both aerobic style exercise as well as resistance exercise. We should be getting enough sleep, as Joe alluded to, and we should break up our sedentary behavior. Prolonged periods of sitting, we should just start to break those up, right? And so obviously in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all these. I'm going to focus on this part here, the idea of aerobic physical activity and the importance of exercise intensity, because there's a trade-off between duration and intensity. You know, it's suggested that we get about 2.5 hours a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. It's not really that much in terms of total time, but it's a daunting amount for a lot of people. And we know that the number one cited barrier for why people aren't more active is time, which I think really just means people don't value the time that might be required in order to benefit their health. And so part of our research is we're just trying to meet people where they are. Okay, you don't want to do 2.5 hours. You can't allocate that. Busy in your life, we get it. So what's perhaps the minimum dose? Or what if we only do a few minutes of daily vigorous physical activity? You know, Joe showed the evidence that maybe that enhances learning. Part of the research in my lab is trying to say, you know what, even that small amount might be enough to move the needle on your fitness, which we know is really important. So how do we characterize intensity? It's fine, we do moderate work, we do vigorous. What does that really mean? And again, it's daunting for individuals, right? We might have this sense that, okay, we should be doing moderate work, but what does that mean? Well, from a health perspective, if you listen to the World Health Organization, the WHO talks about 3 activity levels: light, moderate, vigorous, and it uses these various metrics, including things like ratings of perceived exertion, right? So on a 10-point scale, vigorous exercise is about a 7. We also have organizations like the American College of Sports Medicine that'll subdivide that further. And we have percentages of heart rate, a different rating of perceived exertion scale. If you're an athlete, athletes don't talk about things like that. They talk about moderate, heavy, severe exercise domains, and worse, the moderate levels don't line up with the health benefits suggested by the WHO. And then, of course, athletes might talk about zone training. If you're a fan of some popular social media commentators, Peter Attia, Rhonda Patrick, there's a lot of talk right now about zone 2 training, which you can see there just up from the bottom on the left. So the point being is here, it's very complicated, or we can make it very complicated, but we don't have to. And so what I'd like to talk about here is when I say vigorous, it's work or sufficient effort to get above that vigorous line there. And we can basically subdivide this vigorous zone into very intense sprint interval training, hard as you can go, gut-busting type exercise. That's not what I'm going to focus on today. I'm sort of going to focus on this yellow zone right here. And so again, on a 10-point scale, where 0 is completely sedentary, lying on the couch, 10 is sprint from danger pace, right? Fire alarm goes off, we got to get out of here right away. Or save your child from an oncoming car pace. That's a 10. Vigorous is a 7, as opposed to moderate, which is about a 5, right? So if you're just looking subjectively, that's the type of exercise that I'm going to be talking about. And this idea, I'll show you some evidence to hopefully convince you, vigorous, submaximal, periodic or intermittent exercise is highly scalable and applicable to many different individuals. And so to illustrate that point, I like to show this. These are heart rate tracings from 2 different individuals on very different ends of the fitness spectrum. The top tracing is from a young Olympic athlete. The bottom tracing is from an older individual who has coronary heart disease. Obviously, the absolute workloads that these people might be working at, their heart rates are different because one is older, one is young. But on a relative level, both of these individuals are doing the exact same vigorous exercise protocol, and it's eliciting about 90% of their maximal heart rate. So they're both up in that vigorous zone. And so the point here is vigorous for you. Intensity is relative to the individual. And so we can have 2 people doing the exact same vigorous effort. One is running very fast on a treadmill, and the other is just basically walking. So it's, again, the effort that it would take to be vigorous for you, to get you to a 7 on that 10-point scale. And so the work that we've been interested in is basically asking this question: is brief, vigorous activity a viable approach? Viable in that it might be acceptable to people. They're willing to do it, because our biggest challenge is just getting people to do anything, do something, just move, right? And also viable from a biological standpoint. Can we show the evidence that this is sufficient to move the needle on your fitness so that you can improve it through just brief, vigorous exercise? And so it's basically a pattern like this: go hard, take a break, go hard, take a break, repeat that a couple of times. And we've shown that, yes, this type of exercise, even though it's quite brief, can be very effective. And so the question that we've been asking is, can a few short, hard efforts, total time commitment, less than 15 minutes, with only about 5 minutes of hard or vigorous work, is that enough to move the needle on your fitness, see improvements in your health, lower your risk of dying from all causes? We tend to be really good at rediscovering things in science. This is not really a new concept. And so some of you may have heard of this idea of the 5BX plan. This was a plan developed by the Canadian military in the late 1950s for service members stationed literally by the North Pole during the Cold War, because they were getting very unfit. At one point, 1/3 of Canadian Air Force members were so out of shape, they were deemed unfit to fly, unfit for duty. And so the government came up with this very simple plan that the soldiers could do in these far remote bases that didn't require any special equipment, and it didn't require much time. It was calisthenic-based exercise. 5 basic exercises is what the plan stood for. And eventually, those pamphlets were distributed, 20 million of them, to Canadian households with this tagline: you can get home, or you can get fit by yourself at home, doesn't require elaborate facilities, and it only requires 11 minutes a day. Really, we're just reapplying this concept and studying it scientifically. But again, everything old is new again. Just to make the point of how closely it can resemble some of the changes that we see with more traditional, long-duration type exercise, this is just one study that we did, where by design, we had 2 groups of people doing very different types of exercise, and we had a non-exercise control group, like that group that Joe showed from his study. And they trained for about 3 months, 3 times a week. And so one group was doing this intense sprint-like interval training. So the protocol, 3 20-second all-out or very hard efforts over 10 minutes. Their perceived exertion on a 20-point scale was about a 16. The other group was doing 50 minutes, almost an hour of continuous exercise each session. So the point here is, by design, one group was doing physical activity guidelines, 150 minutes a week. The other group, brief bursts of hard exercise, 1/5 the total time commitment and 1/5 the total amount of exercise. This is the change that we saw in their cardiorespiratory fitness. Both groups, a 2-met improvement. Remember I said how important 1-met is? This was a 2-met improvement in both groups. So it certainly validated that the public health guidelines can work, but it showed that you could see similar changes with these very short, hard efforts. This was more a proof of concept study in the lab, but now what we've been trying to do, or since our study was published, there's just more and more evidence. And so this may be familiar with meta-analyses, where they combine the results of lots of different studies together. Here's 16 different studies, all showing the same thing. This brief, vigorous exercise moves the needle in terms of your fitness by a meaningful amount. And so another term for it is low volume, high intensity interval training. Efficacious, can improve your health, may represent a time-efficient alternative to the more traditional moderate intensity continuous training, and it appears to be intensity dependent. So if you're willing to work a little harder than usual, get into that vigorous range, you can seemingly get away with a lot less volume, and that's what drives the fitness gains. So where we are now in our research is we've moved it out of the laboratory, right? Not having people on specialized bikes. And so what we deem an exercise snack is this: 1-minute bout of vigorous effort performed periodically through the day, right? So as you're going to the session in the morning, maybe you have a backpack, you're carrying it, just do a vigorous walk across campus, right? Or right here, you could take your backpack up and down the stairs for a minute. You could do a series of air squats, burpees, as Joe alluded to. Simple, practical strategies that you can incorporate into your day. And so we're basically asking the question, rather than doing this, requires a 10 to 15-minute time commitment, what if you do this? 3, 4, 5 1-minute exercise snacks spread throughout the day. And we're talking about practical, simple strategies. Stair climbing exercise, jumping jacks, calisthenics, body weight style exercise, doesn't require any specialized equipment. And we have a number of ongoing clinical trials right now, including in individuals with type 2 diabetes, trying to demonstrate the effectiveness of this approach. But I'll leave you with this. And this is basically data on the non-exercise equivalent of an exercise snack. And so what I mean by that is just, this is looking at lifestyle physical activity. And if people engaged in vigorous physical activity as they went throughout their day, this is work that we published in Nature Medicine about a year and a half ago, looking at this concept called VILPA. So vigorous, right? We know where that is now, 7 to 10 on that scale. Intermittent, so periodic. Lifestyle physical activity, right? So just things you're doing as you go about your day. And so you can imagine you just want to get across this vigorous line. So that's showing 24 hours, but maybe if you're walking to the bus or the subway in the morning, you pick up the pace. You're playing with your kids, you play for a vigorous manner. You know, you're shopping, you carry those groceries, and you walk very vigorously across the parking lot to get to your car. And we were saying, what if people did that? And we studied data from a very large data bank in the UK called the UK Biobank. And we followed individuals over a period of 7 years. And we knew how hard their physical activity was because they were wearing activity trackers, right? And so that allowed us to quantify how much time they spent in vigorous physical activity and associate that with their risk of dying from all causes. This is showing that risk on the bottom is minutes per day of vigorous activity, and that's showing the 4 to 5 minute mark. So a significant reduction in their risk of dying from all causes. If you wanted to quantify it, median VILPA, or vigorous lifestyle physical activity, a duration of 4.5 minutes of vigorous effort, 26 to 30% reduction in all-cause mortality, and larger reductions in cardiovascular disease risk. So just striking data that's fitting with the laboratory data from smaller studies suggesting that brief bouts of vigorous physical activity can be extremely beneficial. And so really my take-home message for you today is just this. Brief, vigorous, intermittent physical activity, it can be practical and time efficient. You don't have to change into spandex. You don't have to go to the gym. You can incorporate it as part of your day as a strategy to improve your fitness and your overall health. And hopefully that's linked to your improvement in learning as well. Thanks for your time.
I guess the easy thing that I could do up here is to just try to sell you all on yoga and try to get you to buy memberships at my studio. Maybe not necessary if you only have to exercise for quick bursts of high intensity. But that was really interesting. And I'm not going to stand up here and just talk to you about yoga. I'm going to take you on a little bit more of a personal journey. So Joe gave a snapshot of what my life looks like today. And every time I hear my bio read, I always pinch myself because it sounds like such an incredible, vibrant, successful, purposeful life. And I certainly feel that that's the life that I am living. But 20 some odd years ago, if I just give you a snapshot of that period in my life, I was 10 years into a crystal meth addiction. And I was at my rock bottom. I was sleeping in an abandoned apartment. I remember having just a jar of cake frosting in the fridge, and I ate a spoonful of that every day for about 2 weeks. And I actually experienced many rock bottoms during that decade. It was a very long and arduous period of my life. And I just feel incredibly lucky that I'm here in front of you today, that I'm healthy, that I'm happy, that I'm not struggling with the mental health issues of anxiety and depression that led me to my crystal meth addiction, and that I still have the cognitive ability to speak to you and to share with you the tools and strategies that I am passionate about and that I utilize to keep myself healthy and in a positive mindset and moving in an upward trajectory each and every day of my life. Of course, you know, the graph goes like this for all of us, but when we stand back and we look at the overall trajectory of our lives, the hope is that we're moving upwards in our mindset and in our external successes and just our relationship with ourselves. One subject that I'm really passionate about is self-love. I'm not going to go into that too much this evening, but I do feel that it's important for me to say that without making friends with myself and without forgiving myself for all of the horrible lines that I crossed and the promises that I broke to myself and others and all the different ways in which I damaged relationships and my health and so on during my years of addiction, if I had not forgiven myself for all of that, then I wouldn't believe that I'm worthy of a blessed and beautiful and successful life. And so then all of the tools and strategies that I now use would be meaningless because I would just self-sabotage and I would find ways to cycle back into addiction. So you have to make friends with yourself. I believe that passionately. First and foremost, be your own greatest supporter. Just the way you help a friend and you support a loved one, you've got to give yourself the same grace, okay? So one of the exercises that I find to be really, really beneficial is a personal manifesto. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before. Basically, you figure out what your core values are, and I'm not going to take you through that exercise. I'll let you explore that on your own, but keep it simple. I know for me, one of my core values is laughter and joy. So each and every day of my life, I want to have a belly laugh. That's really important to me. And so I wrote out a few of my core values, and then I created what's called a personal manifesto. So it's a declaration to the universe of what I will and won't stand for, and the principles that I will live by to the best of my ability each and every day. If you make it too long and convoluted, you'll never live up to it. You'll just feel like a failure on day 2 of having your personal manifesto in the back of your mind. So I would recommend just writing out 5 sentences, something like, I listen to my inner dialogue and my nervous system, and when a situation makes me feel like I'm leaking energy, I will exit that situation without apology. I think the women in the room especially can relate to that statement. Or I know what my boundaries are, and I recognize that taking responsibility for someone else's feelings is not something I need to take on. So making declarations like this. I put this photo in, by the way, that's my leg behind my head. I think it's funny. Did anybody catch that? So that was a photo that was featured in an addictions gallery at the Art Gallery of Hamilton, and I thought that was a really neat photo, so I put that in. So you write these 5 sentences or so. You have to write them in the present tense. So don't say, I will do this or I hope to do that. State it, as if it's presently happening, and hang it on your mirror. And if you really want to implement this in a powerful way, read it out loud to yourself every morning and read it out loud to yourself again before you go to bed. And what I love about this is that it really brings clarity to your life. So I'm somebody that's been very indecisive throughout my life. I've had trouble listening to my gut. I will ignore my gut signals and I'll go along with the crowd. And often this has led me to poor decisions. And I've acted impulsively or recklessly as a result. And I think that has something to do with the actual brain of an addict. I think it's structured that way, where we're not able to really perceive future consequences of our choices and our actions. But when I weigh a decision against my personal manifesto, it becomes crystal clear, no pun intended, what I need to do or what I won't do. Because I'll see right away if spending time with a certain person aligns with my values, or saying yes to a job opportunity aligns with my values. And again, I recommend you keep it simple and clear. This has completely changed the trajectory of my life, and I cannot recommend it enough. Before I move on, I do just want to digress for one moment to the practice of yoga. I am absolutely obsessed with yoga. I love it so much. Even just a few minutes of mindful movement and breathing completely changes how I feel and the state of my nervous system. I actually was a yoga instructor for the whole decade that I was a meth addict, okay? So I'd love to say that yoga saved me from drug addiction, but I was just a very frenetic, sort of crazy, scattered yoga teacher that taught very fast-paced yoga classes, if you could imagine, because I was fueled by this amphetamine. But one thing that I love about yoga that I want to just let you know about and inform you on that is interesting information. Yoga is different than any other form of exercise out there because it is the only form of exercise that moves you into a sympathetic state in your nervous system and then into a parasympathetic state over and over and over again over, say, a 60-minute long practice. So in a typical sun salutation, when you raise your arms overhead and your heart rate increases, It's like you're pushing on the gas pedal internally, sort of the fight or flight stress response, which gets a bad rap, but actually is a necessary part of existing and moving forward in life. We just tend to spend a little bit too much time in that state. And then every time we bend forward and our head hangs below our heart, so this would be the second movement of a sun salutation, we slip into our parasympathetic state, so our rest and digest aspect of our nervous system. This is like pushing the brake pedal on your vehicle or on your body. And so in a typical yoga practice, your nervous system is getting this very nourishing and healing massage. And this is why when people leave a yoga class, they have this inexplicable glow. And they don't know why they get it from yoga and from nothing else. And Joe, I know you know what feeling I'm talking about. It's addictive in and of itself. It's such an amazing feeling. So if that little bit of science intrigues you, I definitely encourage you to come out and try a yoga class or go online, do a 15-minute yoga practice, and you'll see how you feel different than you do in any other form of exercise. Okay, so this is going to sound sort of obvious, and I featured a photo here. So after I got off drugs, I went back to Vancouver. A dear friend of mine that supported me through those horrible years, who's a photographer, took photos of me doing a yoga pose in every place in Vancouver that I experienced a rock bottom. So this is a staircase. I used to teach yoga inside that building, but I would do meth in the bathroom there or on the stairwell. So it was a really triumphant feeling to go back to these locations and to express my yogic self, my healed self in these different spots. So this is why I've included these photos. But going back to a purposeful life, and this is going to sound maybe a little bit obvious, but I think we all really struggle with this. You need to figure out what your gifts or your strengths are. Just three strengths, that you bring to the world. And people talk about them being unique. They're only unique because it's your way of expressing them. I used to get hung up on that because I would think, well, I'm a good storyteller or I'm funny. But then I would think, well, that's not a unique gift or strength because there's millions of people out there that are funny or good storytellers. So ask your friends, ask your loved ones, what do they love you for? What do you bring to the table that sort of shines brightly? Chances are it's something that comes pretty easily to you. That's why it's a gift, whether it's public speaking or being a good listener or dancing or whatever it may be. But you need to figure out what they are, and every single day of your life, you need to say to yourself, I am going to do my best to utilize my gifts today to best be of service to myself and my own happiness and my own joy and fulfillment, and to best be of service to others. To me, that makes for a purposeful life, rather than looking for some grand destiny or some big, lofty goal that you're supposed to achieve. Instead, figure out your gifts and make use of them every day. And then be prepared to accept compliments for your gifts. Like actually stand a little taller and say thank you when somebody compliments you on one of your strengths or your gifts. At the same time, you need to recognize what your flaws or your weaknesses are. And I find humans to be very interesting because we tend to deflect our gifts and say, no, I'm not that good at it, or we find a way to make an excuse. But then when somebody calls us out for one of our weaknesses, we get defensive. No, I was listening. Or, no, I'm super patient. I'm a very patient person. What are you talking about? Chances are if you've been called out on something several times, it is a legit weakness. And so for me, just to live a really holistic, a life where I can go to bed at night and feel good about the way that I've shown up in the world is to utilize my gifts and to also be accountable for my weaknesses, to apologize for them, not excessively, but when needed, say sorry and then move forward. So I would encourage you to follow this as a principal guideline for creating a purposeful day and a purposeful life. Okay, so how do we stay open, inspired, creative, and vibrant? I run a whole course on this. I chose my favorite gems from this to share with you in this talk. So daily recipes, the power of breath, and reframing our experiences and redefining failure. So this is something I really recommend. Everything in my talk, of course, I recommend passionately because these are things that I practice myself. But what I want to say to you is whatever emotional or mental state you find yourself to be in, very, very rarely is that an accidental state. Chances are you made a series of decisions in the minutes or hours or days or months leading up to that moment that created the state that you're in. And the powerful thing with this realization is that it means you have a great amount of control over your emotional state, the state of your nervous system, and the quality of your thoughts. But you have to get intentional about these things. And one way to do this is to actually write recipes to create the state that you want to be in. So for example, you could write a recipe. So I like to write a recipe in the morning for how to leave my house a 10 out of 10. So I wake up in the morning and I notice what my first thought is. And for the years that I struggled with depression and addiction, my first thought would be a thought of looming dread and just a cloud of negativity. When I was able to actually shine a light of awareness on the drudgery of that initial thought in the morning, I realized how that was coloring the quality of my day that followed. So even when I got off drugs, I still had like a neural pathway. In yoga, we call this a samskara, where I would wake up in the morning and I would have a dreadful thought, and I would dread my life and I would dread my day. So I had to make a conscious choice to reroute my thought to the positive, even though it felt incredibly contrived and inauthentic. I did it over and over and over again until I created a new samskara or a new neural pathway, and I started to naturally wake up with a positive thought about my life and excitement about how my day was going to unfold. So for me, first thing I do in the morning is redirect my thought if I wake up with a negative thought. I do a health elixir. I love coffee. I love espresso. I was a meth addict after all, so I love caffeine. I probably do 4 espresso shots a day. But I like to put cognitive enhancing supplements into my coffee. So different forms of mushrooms like lion's mane and chaga. I switch it up sometimes. Right now I'm doing a lemon, ginger, collagen, antioxidant, immune boosting drink, and I crave it. It's so delicious. It's low in sugar, and I do that after I do my coffee in the morning, and that really sets me up for a 10 out of 10. I do some dry skin brushing. I do some hammer breathing. So hammer breathing, if you're ever feeling stressed or like in a mid-afternoon slump, and I'm not going to yell it into the microphone, but you take your arms overhead, big inhale through the nose, and then a big H-A, ha, through your mouth. And you use your vocal cords and you just get it out. Get out all the stress and the tension that's just, shrinking you and making you feel, you know what I'm talking about. It's the mid-afternoon, especially when you start to feel that way. But I don't do a full minute of it. I think I'd pass out from hyperventilating if I did. I'd probably just do 5 rounds of it in the morning. And I do my mushroom coffee. Okay, so I would suggest you write recipes for your mid-afternoon slump, preparing for a presentation. So I have a recipe for how to be best prepared to be up here in front of you right now. It's not having espresso afternoon to make sure my nervous system is in a state of calm. It's making sure that my outfit is chosen well in advance and it's clean, because that's a big thing for me, sort of that frenetic like wardrobe craziness. And I arrived 2 hours ahead of time this evening. And it's a good thing I did, because I spent 45 minutes trying to find the building and the parking lot. So if I hadn't written this recipe of giving myself tons of time, I would have been a sweaty, stressed out mess by the time I came into this room. You could also do a recipe for a difficult conversation with a coworker, going on a date. That's a big one for anyone who's single out there. And your nighttime wind down, okay? Okay, so harnessing the power of breath. So here's the thing, you guys. Breath is so powerful, and even as a yoga teacher, as a young, fit yoga teacher, breath was sort of a little bit second priority to me over the poses. I wanted to achieve the flexibility and the athleticism of being able to do these really advanced postures. My mom's a yoga teacher. She has always taught the value of breath and how you can harness its power to energize, to calm, to clear your mind. Whatever state you need yourself to be in, you can use your breath as a tool to help you get there, and sometimes very, very quickly. Like when you think about a child who's crying and hyperventilating. We tell them to take 10 deep breaths. Or we have somebody breathe into a paper bag, right? If they're grief-stricken. And right away, it starts to slow their heart rate, lower their blood pressure, and regulate their inner environment. That being said, I really didn't place the importance on it as I have in the last few years. As a menopausal woman who's now past menopause, I really came to understand how powerful breath is for curing insomnia, for reducing heat in the body and anxiety. And I feel such a deep, intimate relationship with my breath now. I feel so thankful for it each and every day. Here's the thing about breath. It's free, doesn't cost anything. It's available in unlimited quantities. You literally have a sea of breath around you to just drink. You can drink from this ocean of breath whenever you need to. And studies have actually shown that people who describe themselves as depressed or apathetic or chronically fatigued or lethargic, they have measurably longer exhales than they do inhales. It's like their life is sort of one big sigh. And so one way to treat depression and apathy is to increase the length of the inhales and to shorten the length of the exhales just a little bit. The reverse has also been shown to be true. People that describe themselves as anxious or ADD, ADHD. I'm actually medicated for ADHD now. A lot of meth addicts are actually unmedicated ADD and ADHD sufferers. So that was something I had to take the long, hard road to learn. But I would describe myself more as somebody who's a little bit more frenetic, more driven towards worry or anxiety. And those folks tend to have longer inhales and shorter exhales. So something that's really therapeutic for me is to lengthen out my exhalations, even just by a count on each breath. If you're an insomnia sufferer, there's a breath practice called the death breath. You take a 4-count inhale, a 4-count exhale, a 4-count inhale, then a 5-count exhale, and you continue to lengthen your exhalations by 1 count until you reach 10, and then you return back to 4 and 4 and repeat that. And it really does work. I taught it for years before I actually tried it myself, and it actually works. Okay, so my last piece for you that I feel is so important, especially for somebody, again, that did so many regrettable things for an entire decade of my life. I really, in order to keep my mind open and keep the creativity flowing and enthusiasm about my life flowing freely, I really had to make meaning of my past. And that's what I mean when I say you can change the past. People say that the past is already over. There's nothing you can do about that. I disagree with that because you can actually change your relationship to your past, and you can derive lessons from the past that could be very relevant for you right now in your present day life and could actually change and alter the trajectory of your life moving forward from this moment. So I could say that those 10 years of my life were just wasted, shameful, regrettable years. And I did feel that way for quite some time. Those years were shrouded in a lot of shame. And I hoped that my yoga students would never find out about my past. But the truth is, as soon as I started to bring that decade of my life and my mental health issues from beforehand into the light and share that publicly, I found that for myself, my healing exponentially increased. And now those years of my life have an incredible purpose. And I feel that I'm able to serve others by sharing my story. I know that I don't look like a meth addict. I know that it's a surprising truth bomb when I drop that piece, and I know you guys, some of you have had a long day of listening to lectures, and I thought, oh, well, at least I've got a good, bomb to drop in the beginning. It makes people kind of sit up and take notice because you judge a book by its cover, or you think, well, this girl's been doing yoga for 30 years. She's obviously just, the perfect example of health and wellness, but that's not always the case. And I feel that it's really useful to share that publicly. So I've redefined my relationship to the past. we're meaning-making machines, meaning it's up to you how much weight or how much meaning you give something, whether it's positive or negative. It really is up to you, whether it's judgments or criticisms that people have of you, or, a choice that you make. I actually speak to that at the bottom here, or it's on my next slide. But I like to think of life as sort of as a choose your own adventure. So there really are no failures. It's like I decide to go through a certain door, and I'll receive gifts and blessings from choosing that door, and I'll also have to learn hard lessons, right? So an example would be to have kids or not have kids, right? A big decision for all of us. And I would say that neither path is right or wrong. You're going to get different gifts, like sleep if you don't have children. And you're going to have lessons that you have to learn depending on which door you choose. And for those of you that are in school or you're trying to figure out what your career path is, I feel like that can hold us hostage sometimes. We can kind of go into like freeze mode because it can be so overwhelming, all of the options out there, and we're so afraid to make a wrong choice. But I truly believe there are no wrong choices, and you can pivot. You can change your path. You can change as you go. And I would actually relate that back to the personal manifesto. The personal manifesto is not concrete. I've written maybe 10 since I started doing it about 5 years ago, because sometimes certain sentences don't resonate as being important or relevant at this stage in my life, and I replace it with something else that has more meaning. Fail Fast, Fail Often. It's a great book I recommend, and it's all about reframing failure. For example, when I moved home and went to rehab, I was physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally depleted. And I moved back into my teenage bedroom, and I slept. I slept for like the next 5 years. And I went through horrible depression as my brain was trying to rewire itself. And I could look again at those years as being wasted years, or wow, how embarrassing, or what a failure I am. I'm 30 years old and I'm sleeping in my teenage bedroom, and I haven't made any forward movement with my career. But instead, again, in order for me to get out of bed every day and feel good about who I am and live a purposeful life, I reframed that to say, wow, aren't I lucky that I have a loving family that loves me unconditionally and is letting me sleep 14, 16 hours a day, rent-free in my teenage bedroom, so that I can get myself back together and eventually get back out there into the world and live a productive life. And I know a lot of addicts out there don't have that same blessing and luxury of having a supportive family and that kind of stability and foundation to fall back on. So again, for anyone out there that's struggling with feeling like you failed something or you've done something regrettable, honestly, I cannot tell you how important it is to reframe that so that you can continue to feel good about yourself and just see it as a stepping stone as you move through your life. So to recap, to live your best life each day and to remain open to learning, because I'm trying to tie this back into Joe's overall purpose. But I think, all of this is relevant to all of us at any stage of life we're in. Remind yourself of your gifts and how to utilize them each day. Could be generosity, get creative with what your gifts are. Create recipes to raise your state to a 10 out of 10. Develop a deep relationship with your breath and utilize this free and very valuable tool. Accept that you'll face obstacles. You will experience failures. That's just a given. You cannot avoid it. In fact, when on New Year's, on January 1st of every year, I pick a theme word to symbolize what I want to manifest for that year, or what I want to learn about myself and my life for that year. It's a very yogic type of thing to do. But when I do that, I also remind myself, Katie, you're going to have some terrible days this year. You're going to have some days where you experience deep disappointments or losses, or you embarrass yourself. You say things that you wish you hadn't said. Just know that that's going to be part of your 12-month calendar year. And when you encounter one of those days, go, okay, here we are. It's going to be one of those days. I'm going to go into the depths of whatever it is, And I'm going to call on these tools and these practices that I've worked so hard to implement into my daily life to keep me afloat during those difficult days, rather than just trying to avoid the difficult days and the challenges altogether, because it's not possible to do that. Lastly, I do want to say this point always lands with folks, and so I like to put it into any of my talks. It comes back to this 12-month calendar year. Don't think of life, work, balance, or harmony as being in a 24-hour period of 8 hours of work, 8 hours of family time or social time, and then 8 hours of sleep, because that's completely unattainable and doesn't really make for a very fun and spontaneous life either. So instead, think of balance or harmony as being over a 12-month calendar year. So for example, my busy season at the yoga studio is from October to May. I know that during those months, it is go time. I need to hustle. I need to be at the studio. I need to prioritize work. So I would say the pendulum swings heavily in that direction. My social life, even my parenting, it has to become a little bit lower on the priority if I'm going to keep my business going. But then I take my foot off the gas pedal from June until September. Those are my months where I couldn't pay somebody to be in a hot yoga room, right? Because it's July and it's August. So rather than trying to hustle and drive myself crazy with, oh my God, how can I keep the classes going and make money during these summer months? That's when I coast more in the work area and I spend more time with my child and with my friends and nurturing the other areas of my life. And for me, that results in a 12-month calendar year of harmony and happiness and fulfillment. So thank you for listening, and I'm sorry for going over time. You can find me on Instagram. You can email me any questions that you have. I'm always happy to talk to you about addiction. Even though I don't have all the answers, I know that it's something that we all either know somebody who struggles or we struggle ourselves with a behavior or an unhealthy relationship to a substance. And I'm always happy to talk to anybody that wants to hear a little bit more about my journey with that. And of course, about yoga too. So thank you for your time. Thanks, Joe.